This is part two of a video for the slides that were presented on Monday, September 21st. So, a brief overview and history of communism as it exists today. Communism is, again, in opposition primarily to the capitalist system that exists in the United States. Communism was founded by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848 in Germany, so roughly before the Civil War happened in the United States. And they ultimately wrote what was called the Communist Manifesto as their expression of their ideology as a critique of capitalism. So they said that the capitalist system that existed in most of Europe and the United States and had existed throughout most of history since the Industrial Revolution was the subjugation of the masses, of most people, by a select powerful few. The idea that there was a few, they called them the bourgeois, this ownership class that reaped all the benefits of the labor of everyone else, the proletariat. And they said that was just morally unjust. So the idea was that if you are working, if you are doing labor, you are entitled to the benefits of that labor. So if you say are working in a factory and there's 100 of you working in the factory, it's not right that the owner of the factory makes all the profits from all 100 of your labor. Instead, you all should be entitled to at least a equal fraction of the profits with the owner of the factory. And so they're saying that capitalism, as it existed, where the owner of the factory reaped all the profits and didn't give very many to the workers, is inherently discriminatory because it's based on a system of oppression, and it's based on a power structure that existed that was colonial based. So they critiqued the colonial system. They said that most of Europe got their power through subjugation of their colonial subjects. So most of the less developed world at the time. Now, the United States didn't really pay attention to this idea very much that slowly spread through Europe until it made a big jump in Russia. So this guy, Vladimir Lenin, really took these ideas and he organized a bunch of factory workers to rise up in Russia and overthrow the Tsar, who was the king at the time, and establish a communist government. Now he died relatively soon after, and the government was kind of taken over by this guy named Joseph Stalin, who corrupted his idea a little bit, became a very authoritarian state, committed some major atrocities, and it was not the best expression of the notion of communism or either the ideals of Marx or the ideals of Lenin himself. But that's the way it went. So that created what's now known as the Soviet Union, which was, of course, after World War II, when most of Western Europe had been destroyed by the war, really the only major power. And so the United States saw it as a major threat because they said, here's this one other major power, and their economic belief system is totally different than ours, and it is actually the antithesis of ours. And they see us as evil and corrupt, so naturally we see them as evil as well. Again, this happened in Russia, though. It wasn't until Mao and his followers took over China and created a communist state there. Again, a figure who created or committed mass atrocities. It wasn't until that he took over that it really spread, and then in South America, when it landed in the Americas on the continent, the United States really started to take action against communism. As we know, went to war in Korea, in Vietnam, and in other states throughout the world, trying to prevent states from becoming communist and increasingly violently overthrowing governments that even hinted at the idea of a system that was more balanced in power and distribution. Now, this guy threw in history that we don't necessarily need to cover, but I think is interesting. This is Jacobo Arbenz, who was the president of Guatemala back in the early 50s, and he came to power on the platform of helping the coming Guatemalan, many of whom lived in poverty. Most of them who lived in poverty, it was because they were effectively indentured servants to American fruit companies that owned most of the land in Guatemala. So he created a program that raised the minimum wage, and he nationalized some industries like the railroad that the fruit companies needed to use. And so the United States got the CIA overthrew him. They got a military coup in place to bring about a military dictator, and he was forced to flee with some of his followers, including this guy, who would ultimately have a vendetta against the United States that he would continue in his help of overthrowing both the Cuban government and inspiring Latin American communist revolutions for the next 30 years.